the dark truth behind Germany's bomber strategy during World War II, reveals a terrifying reality that military historians have long debated. Why did the Luftwaffe prioritize bombers so heavily when conventional wisdom suggests they should have focused on fighters? The answer lies buried in classified documents and strategic decisions that would ultimately determine the fate of nations. You'll discover that bombers weren't just important to the German war machine, they were absolutely essential, comprising nearly 40% of all operational aircraft from 1939 to 1941. The mystery deepens when you realize that three persistent myths have clouded our understanding of German aviation strategy for decades. First, the belief that Germans were somehow intellectually inferior for not building four-engine heavy bombers. Second, the exaggerated impact of General Walther Wever's death on the bomber program. Third, the false notion that Germany didn't want bombers at all. These misconceptions have created a distorted picture of one of history's most sophisticated air forces. But the truth is far more complex and revealing. To understand why the Luftwaffe built so many bombers, we must first examine the technological landscape of the 1930s. During this crucial decade, bombers held a distinct advantage over fighters in three critical areas: speed, armament, and operational range. The fastest bombers could outrun most interceptors while carrying devastating firepower deep into enemy territory. This technological superiority wasn't accidental. It reflected a fundamental shift in military thinking that would reshape warfare forever. The concept of strategic bombing emerged from the ashes of World War I, when military leaders recognized that future conflicts would be decided not just on battlefields, but in the skies above industrial centers and civilian populations. British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin's famous 1932 declaration that "the bomber will always get through" captured this revolutionary mindset. Baldwin's words weren't mere rhetoric. They reflected a genuine belief that bombers represented the future of warfare, capable of striking decisive blows against enemy morale and industrial capacity. This doctrine found fertile ground in Germany, where military planners faced unique strategic challenges. Unlike island nations such as Britain, Germany was surrounded by potential enemies and lacked natural barriers for defense. The country's central position in Europe meant that any future conflict would likely involve multiple fronts, requiring rapid deployment of forces and the ability to strike quickly at enemy positions. Medium bombers, with their combination of speed, payload capacity, and operational flexibility, seemed perfectly suited to Germany's strategic needs. The man who best understood these requirements was General Walther Wever, the Luftwaffe's first chief of staff. Wever possessed both the vision and determination to transform German aviation doctrine, but his influence has been both exaggerated and misunderstood by historians. Born in 1887, Wever came from an army background, but quickly grasped the revolutionary potential of air power. His strategic thinking went far beyond mere tactical support. For ground forces, he envisioned bombers as instruments of national power, capable of striking deep into enemy territory. Wever's most ambitious project was the development of a four-engine strategic bomber capable of carrying 3,300 pounds of bombs over a distance of at least 1,240 miles. This aircraft, known as the Ural Bomber, was specifically designed to reach Soviet industrial centers located deep behind the Ural Mountains. Wever understood that Germany's massive eastern neighbor possessed industrial capacity that could overwhelm German production if left unchecked. The only way to neutralize this threat was to destroy Soviet factories before they could produce the tanks, aircraft, and weapons needed for a prolonged conflict. However, Wever's death in a flying accident on June 3, 1936, has been cited as the turning point that doomed Germany's strategic bomber program. This interpretation oversimplifies a complex situation and ignores the practical constraints that influenced German aviation development. While Wever's death certainly removed a powerful advocate for heavy bombers, the decision to focus on medium bombers reflected broader strategic and industrial considerations rather than personal preferences. Hermann Göring, who assumed control of the Luftwaffe after Wever's death, faced difficult choices about resource allocation and industrial capacity. Albert Kesselring, Wever's replacement as Chief of Staff, advocated for medium twin-engine bombers that could be produced in greater numbers and deployed more flexibly than their four-engine counterparts. Erhard Milch, who strongly influenced Luftwaffe procurement decisions, calculated that German industry could produce only 1,000 four-engine bombers per year, compared to many times that number of twin-engine aircraft. This calculation proved prophetic when examining actual production figures. The Luftwaffe ultimately built approximately 18,499 bombers during the entire war, with the versatile Junkers Ju-88 accounting for over 9,100 units alone. The Heinkel He 111, Germany's primary medium bomber during the early war years, reached production numbers exceeding 5,600 aircraft. These figures demonstrate that Germany's focus on medium bombers wasn't a strategic mistake, but a rational response to industrial limitations and tactical requirements. The effectiveness of this strategy became apparent during the Battle of Sedan in May 1940, where German bombers demonstrated their true potential as instruments of operational warfare. This engagement, which proved decisive in Germany's Western campaign, shows how bomber interdiction operations were far more crucial than the famous Stuka dive bombers that captured popular imagination. The statistics are revealing. German bombers flew over 10 times more sorties than dive bombers during key operations, fundamentally altering the balance of power on the battlefield. The Luftwaffe committed massive resources to the Sedan operation, deploying 4 major air corps with a combined strength of approximately 1,470 aircraft. This force included 600 medium bombers, Heinkel He 111s, Junkers Ju-88s, and Dornier Do 17s, alongside 250 Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. The bombers' role extended far beyond simple ground attack. They systematically disrupted French communications, destroyed supply lines, and prevented reinforcements from reaching critical positions. During the 8-hour aerial assault that began at 0800 hours on May 13, 1940, German bombers flew nearly 4,000 sorties against French defensive positions. The 2nd Air Corps alone conducted 1,770 missions, while the 8th Air Corps flew 910 sorties. These numbers dwarf the 300 dive bomber sorties that received most historical attention, revealing the true scope of bomber operations during this critical engagement. The psychological impact of these sustained bombing attacks proved as important as their material effects. French defenders, subjected to continuous bombardment for hours, found themselves unable to maintain effective resistance or coordinate defensive actions. The bombers' ability to strike multiple targets simultaneously created confusion and panic that tactical aircraft alone could never have achieved. This demonstrated the fundamental advantage of bombers over other aircraft types, their capacity to influence battles through sustained pressure rather than isolated attacks. General Heinz Guderian, who commanded the German ground forces at Sedan, specifically requested maximum Luftwaffe support because he lacked sufficient mobile artillery for the operation, rather than wait for traditional artillery units to move into position. Guderian recognized that bombers could provide the sustained firepower needed to break through French defenses. This decision reflected a new understanding of how air power could substitute for conventional ground-based weapons while offering superior mobility and striking power. The success at Sedan validated the Luftwaffe's bomber-centric doctrine and influenced subsequent operations throughout the war. However, this strategy also revealed inherent limitations that would become apparent as the conflict expanded. Germany's medium bombers, while effective in continental campaigns, lacked the range and payload capacity needed for sustained strategic bombing against distant targets. This limitation became critical during the Battle of Britain, where German bombers faced modern fighter defenses without adequate escort protection. The technological advantages that bombers enjoyed during the 1930s gradually eroded as fighter aircraft improved in speed, armament, and operational capabilities. By 1941, the newest British and Soviet fighters could match or exceed bomber performance in most categories, fundamentally altering the aerial balance of power. This shift forced the Luftwaffe to adapt its tactics and aircraft deployment, but the basic commitment to bomber operations remained unchanged. Understanding German bomber production requires examining the broader context of Luftwaffe organizational structure and operational doctrine. The German Air Force was built around the concept of combined arms operations, where bombers, fighters, and ground attack aircraft work together to achieve tactical and operational objectives. This approach differed fundamentally from the strategic bombing doctrine adopted by Britain and the United States, which emphasized independent air operations against industrial and civilian targets. The Luftwaffe's bomber force was organized into specialized units called Kampfgeschwader, each typically equipped with approximately 90 aircraft and supporting personnel. These units were designed for rapid deployment and maximum operational flexibility, allowing commanders to concentrate bombing power wherever it was needed most. The emphasis on mobility and adaptability reflected Germany's strategic situation, where rapid decisive action was essential to avoid prolonged multi-front conflicts. The diversity of targets that German bombers were expected to engage demonstrates the comprehensive nature of their operational doctrine. Enemy airfields received highest priority, as establishing air superiority was essential for all subsequent operations. Transportation infrastructure, including railways, bridges, and road networks, formed the second category of targets. Industrial facilities, military installations, and troop concentrations completed the target list, showing how bombers were integrated into overall campaign planning rather than operating as independent strategic weapons. This integrated approach required bombers with specific performance characteristics that differed from pure strategic bombing aircraft. German bombers needed sufficient speed to avoid enemy fighters, adequate defensive armament for self-protection, and the ability to operate from improvised airfields near the front lines. The payload capacity, while important, was secondary to these operational requirements. This explains why Germany focused on medium bombers, rather than pursuing the massive four-engine aircraft that dominated American and British strategic bombing campaigns. The Junkers Ju-88 exemplified this design philosophy, serving simultaneously as a bomber, fighter, reconnaissance aircraft, and ground attack platform. Its maximum speed of approximately 260 miles per hour made it faster than many contemporary fighters, while its operational range of over 1,000 miles provided adequate reach for continental campaigns. The aircraft's modular design allowed for rapid modification and adaptation to changing tactical requirements, demonstrating the flexibility that German planners valued above specialized capability. The Heinkel He 111, while slower than the Ju-88, offered greater payload capacity and proved particularly effective during the early war period. Its distinctive glazed nose section provided excellent visibility for bombing accuracy, while its twin-engine configuration offered better survivability than single-engine alternatives. The aircraft's service record during the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 provided valuable operational experience that influenced subsequent bomber development and deployment. The Dornier Do 17, nicknamed the flying pencil for its slender profile, represented another approach to bomber design. Its high speed and relatively small size made it difficult to intercept, while its excellent handling characteristics allowed for precise bombing attacks. Although it carried a smaller payload than other German bombers, the Do 17's performance advantages made it valuable for reconnaissance and precision strikes against high-priority targets. These aircraft collectively formed the backbone of German bomber operations from 1939 through 1941, when the Luftwaffe achieved its greatest successes. Their effectiveness depended not just on individual performance characteristics, but on their integration into comprehensive air operations that combined bombing, fighter escort, and ground support functions. This holistic approach to air warfare reflected German military thinking that emphasized coordination between different arms and services rather than independent operations. The strategic logic behind Germany's bomber emphasis becomes clearer when examining the country's geopolitical situation during the late 1930s. Unlike maritime powers such as Britain and the United States, Germany faced the prospect of land-based conflicts against multiple enemies simultaneously. This situation required air power that could rapidly shift between different theaters and provide immediate support for ground operations. Strategic bombers, with their specialized requirements and limited flexibility, were poorly suited to this operational environment. The German concept of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, depended heavily on the coordination between ground forces and tactical air support. Bombers played a crucial role in this doctrine by disrupting enemy communications, destroying supply lines, and preventing the concentration of defensive forces. This tactical use of bombers required different aircraft characteristics than strategic bombing missions, emphasizing speed, accuracy, and rapid deployment over maximum payload capacity. The success of this approach during the early war period validated German strategic thinking and encouraged continued emphasis on bomber production. The rapid conquest of Poland in September 1939 demonstrated how effective bomber ground coordination could achieve decisive results in minimal time. The subsequent campaigns in Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, and France reinforced this lesson, showing how properly employed bombers could compensate for numerical disadvantages in ground forces. However, the strategic situation changed dramatically following Germany's attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941. The vast distances involved in the Eastern Front campaign stretched German bomber capabilities to their limits, while Soviet industrial capacity began producing replacement aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. The initial success of Operation Barbarossa, where German forces claimed to have destroyed over 2,000 Soviet aircraft on the first day alone, proved temporary as Soviet production ramped up and new aircraft entered service. The changing nature of aerial warfare also affected bomber effectiveness as the war progressed. Improved radar systems, better fighter aircraft, and more sophisticated defensive tactics reduced the advantages that bombers had enjoyed during the early war period. The Battle of Britain in 1940 marked a turning point where German bombers faced organized fighter opposition supported by integrated air defense systems. The resulting casualties forced changes in bomber tactics and highlighted the limitations of medium bombers against well-defended targets. Despite these challenges, the Luftwaffe continued to prioritize bomber production throughout the war, even as resources became increasingly scarce. The persistence of this strategy reflects both the institutional commitment to bomber operations and the practical reality that bombers remained essential for supporting ground operations. Even when strategic bombing became impossible, tactical bombing continued to provide valuable support for German ground forces facing increasingly difficult situations. The final phase of German bomber development focused on advanced aircraft designs that might restore the technological advantage that bombers had enjoyed during the 1930s. The Arado R-234, the world's first operational jet bomber, represented an attempt to leap ahead of Allied fighter development. However, production problems and resource shortages limited its impact, with only 214 aircraft completed before the war's end. The story of German bomber strategy during World War II reveals a complex interplay of technological capabilities, strategic requirements, and industrial limitations. Rather than reflecting strategic blindness or technological backwardness, The Luftwaffe's emphasis on bombers represented a rational response to Germany's unique military situation. The medium bombers that formed the core of German air power proved highly effective in the tactical and operational roles for which they were designed, achieving remarkable success during the early war period. The misconceptions surrounding German bomber strategy have obscured important lessons about the relationship between technology, doctrine, and strategic objectives. The Luftwaffe's experience demonstrates that aircraft effectiveness depends not just on individual performance characteristics, but on how well those characteristics match operational requirements and strategic objectives. The German focus on medium bombers, while ultimately unsuccessful in achieving victory, reflected a sophisticated understanding of how air power could support broader military objectives. The legacy of German bomber operations during World War II extends far beyond the immediate tactical results achieved during specific campaigns. The integration of bombers into combined arms operations, the emphasis on operational flexibility, and the recognition of air power's role in supporting ground forces all influenced post-war military thinking. Modern air forces continue to grapple with many of the same challenges that confronted German planners during the 1930s and 40s, seeking the optimal balance between specialized capability and operational flexibility. The dark truth behind Germany's bomber strategy ultimately reveals not incompetence or strategic blindness, but a sophisticated attempt to solve complex military problems with limited resources. The Luftwaffe's emphasis on bombers reflected a clear understanding of how air power could contribute to national objectives, even if the ultimate strategic goals proved unattainable. This recognition that bombers were indeed the king and queen of the German Air Force helps explain why they maintained such a central role in Luftwaffe operations throughout the war, even as the strategic situation deteriorated and victory became increasingly unlikely. The terror and destruction that German bombers brought to cities across Europe during World War II should not obscure the historical significance of their development and deployment. Understanding why the Luftwaffe built so many bombers provides crucial insights into the evolution of air power doctrine and the complex relationship between technology, strategy, and military effectiveness. This knowledge remains relevant today, as military planners continue to wrestle with similar challenges in an era of rapidly evolving technology and changing strategic requirements.